Pearson R product moment coefficient of correlation. So in the outline of this part of this discussion, we'll talk about the coefficient of correlation. What is this? And then the assumptions about correlation calculations, meaning what are the requirements that we could assume so that we can proceed to this particular calculation. And then how to calculate the manual calculation and how to interpret. Okay, so because wala na nag-end nga nakahuman na nimo compute mo na ang answer. You need to know what's the meaning of this solution or answer ninyo sa inyong calculation. And that's the beauty and that's the essence of statistics, because statistics tries to find meaning from data. So if we have numbers, we use statistics to find meaning from those numbers. One ay part sa interpretation in the concept of statistics. Okay, the correlation coefficient, or meaning the answer for product moment coefficient of correlation is indicated by the letter R. So ang atong i-compute is the letter R. I don't know asagi ka na R, probably in terms of shortcut for relationship or correlation, relation, meaning itong R niya. Now, the values from the computation or calculation of this R ranges from -1 to +1. From -1 to +1 and others in between. So kung mag-calculate ka, these are the possible answers from -1 to +1. Dili na mo sobra og 1. So kung nakay answer sa imong calculation nga 1.1, then there's something wrong with your calculation. Okay, so remember that it's from -1 to +1. The number indicates the strength of the relationship, meaning the closer the value to 0, the weaker the relationship. So kung mag-compute na ta, kung ang value that you have computed is closer to 0, meaning the relationship between the two variables that we computed is weak. And then the closer it is to either positive or -1, the stronger the relationship. So meaning, kung dool sa 1, 0.99 for example, that's a very strong relationship. 1 is a perfect relationship. We'll talk about that later also. The sign, kanang positive, negative, indicates whether the relationship is positive or negative. So when we say positive, the first variable, if the first variable is high ang value, it means nga taas pud ang value sa other variable. So that's what I've told you about the previous example. For example, the longer time for studying, the time for studying and in terms of the number of hours and the final grade. So our assumption based on theory, the longer is the time for studying, the higher also the grade. That's an example of a positive relationship. So probably positive ang answer anis ato ang R, if that's the case. Negative relationship means if taas ang isa ka variable, naturally ubos po ang value sa other variable. So example nato is dili na time of studying, time for playing. For example, time for playing video games or computer games. The higher is the time for playing video games, the lower is also the grade. So katong grabe mo dula, gagmay grado. I'm not saying sakto na siya, but just as an example, if that's the case, that's an example of a negative relationship. Meaning, mas longer ka magdula sa computer, mas lesser ang mong grade. So that's a negative relationship. And naturally, kung negative relationship, the lesser your time for computer games, the higher is your grade. So that's also an example of, that's the same case with that particular example. Okay, this is the equation for R. So kung tanaw niyo on the R sub X and Y, meaning the relationship or the correlation between X and Y. X and Y refers to the two variables that we are trying to correlate or to find relationship. And then mga sigma na, we'll talk about that later. Pero that's as simple as it is. And then naayuban nga letter S sub X and S sub Y. This refers to the variance, meaning this refers to the univariate property of each of the set of variables of X and then Y. N is the number of observations, meaning kung pila ka pairs of values. For example, katong 47 ka students, Gitan-aw na to, gisurvey na to pila ang ilang study time and their final grade. And he refers to 47, meaning pila ka book estudyante ang atong gistudihan. In this case, depende on unsay given nato nga data, that's the value of n, meaning the number of observations. Okay, let's look at an example here. So this is a data, hypothetical data, meaning this is not a true data gyud nga gikan sa from the real world. Example lang ni nga hypothetical nga himo lang nako nga example. So there are A to J, there are 10 cities nga tong gi-label from A to J, napulo ka city, and then we take down their number of hospitals and the rate of maternal mortality, or MMR, or maternal mortality rate. Maternal mortality rate is look at it this way, mura siya kuan. The number daw, if you look at this in the dictionary or kuan ko, i-google ninyo, it's a number of mortality, meaning death among pregnant women per year. So meaning 5 here means per murag kuan ni siya per 1,000 pregnancies. So meaning 5 kada 1,000 ka pregnant nga women in that particular city, 5 ang mamatay. So this is actually a standard nga indicator for development and health sa mga cities. Meaning cities are actually evaluated by the DILG based on this. Among all the indicators, isa ni siya because it tells us how efficient is the health sector development in a city. So the higher is the maternal mortality rate, dili cluster or dili klaro ang lang health services sa mga citizens. The lower, meaning guwapo ilang serbisyo sa mga katawhan in terms of health. Ilang mga barangay health center, sakto ang serbisyo, sakto ang provisions of medicines, sakto ang kadaganon silang doktor, and so on. And then natay values of the number of hospitals. So city A, kaning nga syudad, kaning letter A nga syudad, 5 kabuk yang hospital, and then 5 yang maternal mortality rate per year, meaning 5 ang mamatay per 1,000 nga pregnancies in that particular area, that particular city, and so on with the others until letter J. Now, meaning pila ka observation tanan, kumunta na tag pila ang observation, ani nga data, pila ka buok observations, 10. Meaning 10. So this refers to the number of pairs of values. Kung yung tag observation, pairs of values, so 5 and 5, 10 and 2. So J, napulo sila ka buok. Okay, we'll be using that particular term later. Now, para mas masabta na itong relationship ani, because let's say atong theoretical framework dire, meaning ang atong assumption or ang gusto nato ansiran with our problem here is that we may be asking, does the number of hospital influence its maternal mortality rate? That's our research question. Meaning we try to find out if kanibang kadaghanon sa atong hospital naaba ni epekto or contribution sa maternal mortality rate in a particular city. Now, why are we asking this? On a development level, let's say mga decision makers ta, we want to make an argument or a basis or a proof nganong kinahanglan mo suporta sa, let's say, proposal nga magdugang og hospital ani nga lugar. Mangutana dayon si mayor, mangutana ang congressman, nganong gusto man gyud mo nga dugangan pag pila ka hospital dire? Unsa may kuan day ana? Now, sir, we have proof nga kung padaghanon nato ang hospital, mugamay ang maternal mortality rate. Where's that proof? So, meaning, kung mangayog proof, then we go to the actual data. So, tanawon na to ang data, sir. And then, statistically, we will prove nga it is a good choice if we add more hospitals. Now, first and foremost, if you look at data, dili pa nato maklaro ma-picture out kung may pattern, di ba? First and foremost, tanawon gyud nato if there are patterns in the data. So the first thing that we can do is we create what we call as a scatter plot, or in other books it's called a scattergram. We try to create a murag kuan siya, a graph na x and y, and then i-plot out nato ang katong data from the 10 cities. So kaning dots or kaning diamonds are the different cities, and then kung asa sila nabutang sa graph, that refers to their number of hospitals and MMR. So for example, kaning value, this is city nga naay pila ni isa ka hospital and then 10 iyahang maternal mortality rate. Okay? Nakuha ninyo?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Kani siya nga city, duha ka buk iyang hospital,
8
and then 8 ang mortality rate, maternal mortality rate niya, and so on. So kaning nasa ubos, napulo ang iyahang hospital, duha lang iyang maternal mortality rate. Now, I was talking about patterns. What patterns are we seeing here? Kung si pasabot ani nga kuan, kung kaning mga plot lang atong tanawon, does the data have a pattern or a behavior, or natay na notice nga kuan mura gi-follow nila nga standard or behavior? Can we actually say here nga naay kuan, naay relationship ang hospitals ug MMR?
Sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, very good. Diba? Tanawon nimo ang graph, murag paubos siya, mura siya nag-form sila line. So meaning, the relationship here probably is, kung paubos siya, it means nga, the more hospitals there are in a city, the lesser ang maternal mortality rate. Right? Oh, the death or mortality of pregnant women. So we see a clear relationship here. Hence, we can actually proceed to Pearson R product moment coefficient of correlation. There's no doubt that there could be a good value of the coefficient of correlation, or R, in this particular case sa atuang data. Now, when we look at patterns, I want you to be familiar with the different patterns in a scatter plot. So, tanawon ninyo ni, these are examples of the types of correlation. So kung mupurma siya ginani pataas, makita ninyo ang cursor sa mouse, no, kung asa nagtudlo.
Yes, sir.
Okay, kung pataas siya, this is a positive relationship. Meaning, the higher the number of x, or the higher the value of x, this is x and this is y, the higher the value of x, the higher is also y. Tanaw ni mo dire, taas ang value aning sa x dire, taas po diyang y. So kung paano ang forma, that's a positive correlation. Ang bali is a negative correlation. Just the same with our previous example. So pabali. Meaning, kung negative ang correlation, the higher the value of x, the lower the value of y. Meaning, kani ang y, di ba, ubos dire. So kani, taas ang value sa x, ubos yung value sa y. Na kung inani ang forma, kung mag-scatter plot ta, this means nga walay correlation. So there's no need actually to proceed with Pearson R. Kay mag-compute ka duol ra gid sa zero, gyapon almost zero ang value ani. So wala kayo tay ma-interpret. So this is what we call as no correlation. This is what we call as perfect correlation. Kani ika-upat. Perfect kay it forms a straight line. So when we say it's a perfect correlation, kung pila ang value sa x, the same ra pud ang madugang sa y. So perfect correlation. Although in the strictest sense, this is only true in treated conditions, meaning sa laboratory pwede nato ni kuan correlation. We have an additional in terms of how strong or how weak the relationship is. Kung dugol gani ang mga points, that's a strong correlation. Kung almost straight line, nagkaduol siya as a straight line, that's a strong correlation. Pero if it forms a line gyapon pero lagyo siya, that's a weak correlation. It could be closer gyapon to 1 compared to no correlation, pero not as close to a strong correlation. Okay, so those are different types of correlation. Nakuha ninyo?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's proceed. Be ready with your be ready with your calculators and your paper. Okay, so we have this sample problem. Kanyong mo ganina, mo gihapon kani. Mura ni siya. So, gihimo na tong X ang number of hospitals, Y ang maternal mortality rate para magamit na to ni kay X of Y man. So, X here is the number of hospitals, Y is maternal mortality rate. So that becomes kaning data nato butang ra nato dire. So X here morning number of hospitals, Y here is maternal mortality rate. Then we add, okay, I'll give you time, kopyahan ninyo sa inyong papel kanisang X and Y. Okay. Siguro mga 1 minute siguro. So X and Y kopyahan ninyo sa inyong papel. And then after the X and Y, if you notice balik to sa tungkuan ay sigma XY, na sigma X, na sigma Y. Sigma refers to summation, right? I-add na to tanan. So pasabot ani, i-add na to tanan XY, i-add na to tanan X. Kaning sigma X means you add all the X's. Sigma Y refers to the sum of all the Y. So atuan ang compute dire. That's why we have to have XY and we also have X squared and Y squared. So say pasabutan ni XY means the product of X and Y. So if we compute for XY of this city, that's 5 times 5 equals 25. Next is 10 times 2, that's 20. Nakuha ninyo?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Ang X squared, square nimo ang X. So this is 5 times 5, so 25. 10 times 10, 100. 4 times 4, 16, and so on. And Y squared is the square of Y, or you multiply Y by itself. So 5 times 5, 25, 2 times 2, 4, and so on. Nakuha ninyo?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you can continue, i-fill up ninyo, o pwede nyo kopyahon lang diretso as long as you know the concept. Or you try sa inyohang calculator kung sakto ba ning ako ang example. Okay? I'll give you another minute para ma-fill up na siya tanan. Kaning XY, X squared, o Y squared. Okay, so once you have this data, kaning sigma dire, these are all summations, right? Nakuha na ninyo si pasabutan
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay, these are all totals. So sigma X means the total of X, sigma Y is the total of Y, sigma X, Y is the total of X and Y, the product of X, Y, and so on. Y, sigma X squared, sigma Y squared. So, kaning mga sigma na ni dire, mao na to'y ibutang na to sa values here, right? Na kay, if you look back sa katong dire, you already have sigma XY, na kay sigma X, na po kay sigma Y. And you also have N, right? Ang N is pila ang N?
10.
10, very good. Okay. Ang kulang na lang is na to kaning dire. S sub X and S sub Y. So these are the variances. Variance of X, variance of Y. So we have a separate formula for that. Okay, let's continue. Okay, let's look at this. Okay. Remember this, na kay sigma X, na kay sigma Y. So, mo-proceed ta later sa katong S sub X and S sub Y. So, let's compute first sigma x quantity squared and sigma y quantity squared. Now, this is different from sigma x squared and sigma y squared. Lahi ni siya. Because sigma x squared is the total or the summation of all squares of x. And sigma y squared is the summation of all squares of y. Sigma x quantity squared is the square of the total of x. And sigma y quantity squared is the square of the total of y. Meaning, ang kalahian, if this is sigma x squared and sigma y squared, sigma x squared is square ni mo daan, you square all the values first, and we add all. Sigma y squared means you square everything and then you add all of them. The difference with sigma x quantity squares, i-add sa nimo daan tanan x, ay nimo i-square. You add all the x first and then you square. Sigma y quantity squared, also you add all the y first and then you square. Now we have values now of all the x and all the y here. So sigma x is 64, sigma y is 56, meaning that's a total of all the y, the total of all the x. Hence we have 64 squared because 64 is the total of all x. 56 squared, 56 is the total of all y, and then is squared. So the value now for sigma x quantity squared is 4096. The value for sigma y quantity squared is 3136. Okay, nakuha ninyo?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so nanatay duha ka values for this. Asa man na gamiton? As I've said, ang variance or S man ang ato ang pangitaon. So this is not the formula for that. So S sub x is equal to the square root of sigma x squared, katong bago ra na katong ganina nato i-compute. From here, sigma x squared 520 minus sigma x quantity squared. Lahi ning duha, di ba? Sigma x squared and sigma x quantity squared is different. So sigma x quantity squared is 4096. So that's why you have 520 minus 4096 divided by 10. Divided by n man, so meaning ang n is 10, divided by 10 minus 1 because n is also 10. Okay, try ninyo sa inyong calculator kung sakto ba. Okay, take note of MDAS. So unahon nimo ang multiplication of division before ka mag-subtraction and addition. So minus man unahon sa nimo ning division diri, that's 4096 divided by 10. So that would be equal to 409.6, right? So mo sa na minus nimo sa 520. So 520 minus 409.6 is equal to 110.4. Divided by 10 minus 1 is 9. So kung 110.4 divided by 9 is equal to 12.267. So ay ka mag-square root. The square root of 12.267 is 3.502. Were you able to follow? Nakukuha ninyo sa inyong calculator?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes.
very good. Now you do the same thing to S sub y. So sa S sub y, i-follow lang ninyo ang quandary. So sigma y squared minus sigma y quantity squared divided by 10 over 10 minus 1. Square root dayon. So ang sigma y squared is 374. Tanaw na to dre. That's 374, right? Okay. Minus 3136, that's our sigma y quantity squared. Divided by 10. So 303.6. So 374 minus 313.6 divided by 10 minus 1, which is 9. So, check ninyo kung 60.4 ba. 374
Yes, sir.
minus 313.6. Okay, good. I-divide ng duha, 60.4 divided by 9, 6.711. And then, square root ninyo. So, your answer should be 2.591. Okay. Nakuha ninyo 2.591
Yes,
ang
sir.
S sub Y. Okay, okay, very good.
Yes, sir.
So, kumpleto na ta. Di ba? Going back to our general equation, kumpleto na ta. Nanay sigma xy, natay n, na sigma x, sigma y, na ay S sub x, and S sub y. Okay, let's proceed. So, naanan and then, okay, next na to is this one. So, mo man ang formula, di ba? So, i-fill up lang tanan. Sigma xy is 285 minus 1 over 10, that's 1 over n. Sigma x is 64. Sigma y is 56 divided by 10 minus 1, kaning n minus 1. Ang S sub x is 3.502. The one that we have just recently calculated, times S sub y, which is 2.591. Then you do MDAS, meaning you put this out first sa taas, sa ubos, ayan na to i-divide. Then we start with multiplication, and then division. Okay. So, kani sa babaw tanan, dapat it should be equal to negative 73.4. Okay, so kindly do the calculations. Pwede ninyo ang 1 over 10, i-divide sa, mahimo siyang 0.1, right? 0.1 times, kani, 64 times 56, or i-divide sa 10 sa kanitanan. 64 times 56 divided by 10, ay na i-minus na to sa 285. That should be equal to negative 73.4. And then sa ubos, 10 minus 1, that becomes 9. And then i-multiply ra silang tulo because puros man multiplication. That's very crucial ha kung kuan sa pag-calculate ninyo ang MDAS. You start with multiplication first, and then division, and then addition, and then subtraction. Wala may addition dire.
Minus. Yung.
Okay. Nakuha ninyo ang kuan, ang final result of R, negative 0.899.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So that's now our coefficient of correlation.
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's our coefficient of correlation. Okay, very good. Thank you very much for following religiously. So negative 0.899 is the value of our R, or our coefficient of correlation. Okay, so that's negative 0.899. So look at this. These are the assumptions. Before proceeding to coefficient of correlation, dapat masatisfy sa nato ni. First is that the relationship should be linear. So going back to our linearity, how do we find out if it's linear or not? So, tanaw na to sa itong scatter plot. If it's linear, if it follows a certain line. So in this case, ni puro masyag linya, meaning the relationship is assumed to be linear. And then the variables are measured on an interval or ratio scale. Kaya ilan naman taon sa interval o ratio, right? So, kung tanaw na to ni number of hospitals and MRR, that's interval. Rather, ratio. Because hospital is a ratio scale. And then the distribution of the variable is normal. We don't have much time to explain this, but normality refers to a bell-shaped curve kung imong i-plot siya, meaning the largest number or mas daghan nga observation is closer to the mean. Meaning kung unsay mean sa ato ang tanan observations, 100 ka book for example, kung unsay, let's say, unsay average nga age nato tanan diri sa classroom. Let's say, 20. Meaning, mas daghan sa atoa ang 20 ang edad compared to other age. That's normal nga distribution. If it's dili siya normal kung mas daghan ang more than 20 for example ang edad. If ang average nato is 20. Now, dili nato we cannot actually say the normal or dili ning atong example in terms of distribution kay napulo raman. We can't actually see the normality here. But anyway, you can do some further readings of that kung unsa ang normal distribution. Dali ra na i-Google, there are even YouTube videos for that. What is a normal distribution? So, the data should be normally distributed for us to use Pearson R as our statistical analysis nga tool nga gamiton for this particular case if we're trying to find relationships. Okay, going back to correlation coefficient, katong value sa R. Mungutana na dahil po, unsa di pasabot di anang R sir? Nga negative 0.899. Unsa pasabot ana ron? Unsa may meaning anang ilang relationship? That's why we have this table here. This refers to the magnitude of R. Magnitude refers to the extent or the level of relationship based on the value of R. So kung 1 ang iyang value, it means there's a perfect correlation. In this case, dili, di ba? Wala kabot og 1. That's negative 0.899. So dirita mo fall sa kaning mga ranges. So kung 0.80 to 0.99, that's a very strong relationship. Otherwise, kung less than 80, meaning 0.60 to 0.79, that's a strong relationship. Na po gitawag o moderate, which is kung 0.40 to 0.59 ra yung value. It's weak if it's 0.20 to 0.39. And then very weak if it's gikan sa 0 hangtod 0.90, that's a very weak relationship. In our example, the value is negative 0.899. So unsa may label nato for or interpretation nato sa relationship?
Very strong, sir.
Okay, very strong.
Strong, very strong.
Okay, very good. So sa
Very
research,
strong, sir.
sa research nato later on or sa ato ang mga thesis, for example, if we use Pearson R, we interpret it that way. Now, there's a very strong imo pong isulti kung negative or positive. Positive ba? Negative atong relationship?
Negative.
Okay, negative. So there's a very strong negative relationship between the number of hospitals and maternal mortality rate in a city. So that's our interpretation. And then usay meaning ana, we can actually say nga this means that if there are more hospitals in a city, we can actually say that there are less maternal mortality rate in that particular city also. And vice versa. If there are lesser hospitals, mas taas po ang maternal mortality rate. And that's a very strong relationship. Nakuha ninyo? That's interpretation. Ano yung pag-interpret na to sa value sa R? Okay, you get it?
Sir.
Okay. Now, we don't end. There are still other forms of interpretation. There are still other statistical statistical interpretations. We can also compute for the R squared. The R squared is also called the coefficient of determination. So remember that R is coefficient of correlation. R squared is coefficient of determination. Coefficient of determination, percent variance that is shared between variable X and variable Y. Meaning, or why is it that the maternal mortality rate in the different cities are different from each other? The answer is, kung basihan nato ni sa ato ang R squared, the answer is because there are different values of Y or maternal mortality rate, because there are also different values of the number of hospitals in a city. Then we may ask, up to what extent does maternal mortality rate, or up to what percent is maternal mortality rate affected by the number of hospitals? That's the value of the R squared. R squared value is positive 0.808. Now, ang interpretation sa R squared is in terms of percentage. So you convert 0.808, which is a decimal, into percent. Pila man? Saan gani pag-turn ang decimal into percentage?
Times 1,000.
Times 100.
Okay, times 100, or you move the decimal place 2 places to the right, di ba? So kung ang point 3 or decimal na dire, i-move na to dire, so it becomes 80.8%. So kung interpretation, meaning na dahil nani, 80.8% of the variation in MMR is influenced by the variation in the number of hospitals. Mo nay gamit aning R squared. So ang R squared is just the square of R, and then you turn that into percentage. That's the percent of the variation in maternal mortality rate, which is influenced by the variation in the number of hospitals. Ngayon di ka asa na ditong uban sir nganong di man 100%. So it means nga dili tanan mortality of pregnant women in that area is caused by hospitals. Unsay nabilin? Ang nabilin is what we call as coefficient of alienation. So coefficient of alienation, that's just 1 minus R squared. So 1 minus 0.808. That's the coefficient of alienation. That's the percent variance that is not shared between variable X and variable Y. So balik ta dire, 1 minus R squared is equal to, i-compute niyo, 1 minus 0.808.
0.192, sir.
Okay, 0.192.
92.
I-convert that into percent, that is
19.2.
okay, 19.2%. Consequently, that's just the remaining balance na percentage sa 80.8. So, kung i-add mo ng duha, that's 100%. Meaning, the 80.8 na reason sa MMR is hospitals. The rest, 19.2, these are, ang MRR is caused by the 19.2 nga aside from the number of hospitals. So meaning there are other factors that causes the increase or decrease in MMR, which is not di na to pwede maingon nga ang hospital ang reason, because there could be other factors, right? Maybe in terms of education, maskin pagdaghan og hospital diya nga area, pero ang family is not aware nga kinahanglan gyud magpa-check up pirme, kinahanglan kuan ani nga mga vitamins or tambal. So that's one factor nga even though daghang hospital ngano nagya po yung MMR. So there's 19.2% nga cause sa MMR, which is not hospitals or aside from hospital. It could be education or income, for example. Maskin pag 100 kabuk hospital na ng lugar, walay ika-afford ang family, then probably that causes health risk to the pregnant woman. Or maybe distance, right? Daghan lagi hospital pero ilang lugar layo gyud kay sa hospital, so lisod kayo yadto. So those are the factors in 19.2. Although gamay ra kayo, so meaning we can actually say nga there's statistically a relationship between number of hospitals and MMR.